The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the first thing I heard as I slowly regained consciousness. My throat felt like sandpaper, my body ached in ways I'd never experienced, and there was a tube down my throat that made breathing feel foreign and mechanical. Through my blurred vision, I could see my husband Daniel pacing frantically beside my hospital bed, his usually perfectly styled hair disheveled, his business shirt wrinkled and stained with what looked like coffee and tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last thing I remembered was sitting at his mother's dining table, forcing myself to eat her famous lasagna despite the strange metallic taste that seemed stronger than usual. I remembered thinking it was odd how insistent Vivian had been that I finish every bite, how she'd hovered over me with that peculiar smile, refilling my wine glass whenever it got low. Then everything went black. My name is Isabella Chen, and I never thought I'd be the kind of person to have a story like this. I was raised to see the best in people, to give second chances, to believe that family meant everything. My parents had immigrated from Taiwan when I was just 2 years old, working double shifts at their small restaurant to give me opportunities they never had. They taught me respect for elders, the importance of family harmony, and the value of keeping peace even when things got difficult. When I met Daniel Hartwell 3 years ago at a medical conference in Seattle, I thought I'd found my fairy tale. He was a successful cardiologist, kind, intelligent, and seemed to genuinely care about making the world a better place. Our courtship was like something out of a romantic movie. He'd surprise me with handwritten notes tucked into my research files, bring me coffee during my late nights at the lab where I worked as a pharmaceutical researcher, and listened intently when I talked about my work developing new allergy medications. Daniel proposed to me on a rainy Thursday evening in Pike Place Market, the same place where we'd had our first official date. He got down on one knee right there among the fish vendors and flower stalls, completely unbothered by the curious crowd that gathered around us. When I said yes, I thought I was saying yes to a lifetime of happiness, partnership, and building something beautiful together. The first red flag should have been how Daniel's mother, Vivian Hartwell, reacted to our engagement announcement. We'd driven the 2 hours from Seattle to her sprawling colonial home in Bellingham to share the news in person. Daniel was nervous, which I found endearing at the time. He kept adjusting his tie and clearing his throat as we sat in her pristine living room, surrounded by antique furniture and family portraits that seemed to watch our every move. When Daniel finally told her about our engagement, Vivian's reaction was immediate and chilling. Her face went completely blank for a moment, then twisted into what I can only describe as barely controlled rage. She looked at the ring on my finger like it was some kind of infectious disease, then fixed her pale blue eyes on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Well," she said finally, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I suppose congratulations are in order." But there was no warmth in her tone, no genuine happiness for her son's joy. Instead, there was something calculating, something almost predatory in the way she studied me. From that moment forward, Vivian made it clear that I would never be good enough for her precious son. It started with small digs disguised as helpful suggestions. She'd comment on my appearance, suggesting I might want to do something about my hair or try a different style of dress that might be more flattering. She'd make pointed remarks about my accent, which barely existed after living in the United States for over 2 decades, asking me to repeat myself as if she couldn't possibly understand what I was saying. But the worst part was how she dismissed my severe food allergies. I have a life-threatening allergy to shellfish and tree nuts, something I'd lived with since childhood. It's not a mild sensitivity or a dietary preference. It's a medical condition that requires me to carry an EpiPen everywhere I go and be extremely careful about cross-contamination. One exposure could send me into anaphylactic shock and potentially kill me within minutes. I'd explained this to Vivian multiple times, always politely, always with Daniel present to back me up. I'd shown her my medical alert bracelet, explained the symptoms, even offered to provide her with information from my allergist so she'd understand the severity of the condition. But Vivian had her own theory about allergies. "Oh, Isabella, dear," she'd say with that condescending smile that never reached her eyes, "I really think these modern allergies are largely psychological. When I was growing up, children ate everything and were grateful for it. All these sensitivities and special diets are just attention-seeking behavior, if you ask me. The first time she said this, I was so shocked I couldn't even respond. Daniel had jumped in, firmly but respectfully, explaining to his mother that food allergies were serious medical conditions with potentially fatal consequences. Vivian had simply waved her hand dismissively and changed the subject, as if the conversation was beneath her consideration. Over the months leading up to our wedding, Vivian's hostility toward me became increasingly obvious, though she was always careful to mask it when Daniel was around. She'd make cutting remarks about my career, suggesting that perhaps I should consider something more traditional for a doctor's wife. She questioned her ability to give her proper grandchildren, making thinly veiled comments about mixed-race children and whether they'd really fit into the Hartwell family legacy. The wedding planning became a battlefield. Vivian had very strong opinions about everything from the venue to the guest list to my choice of wedding dress. She'd already planned Daniel's wedding in her mind, apparently, and my actual preferences were merely inconvenient obstacles to her vision. When I suggested we serve Asian fusion cuisine at the reception to honor my heritage, she looked at me like I'd suggested we served garbage. "I think it's best if we stick with something more universal," she'd said, her lip curling slightly. "We don't want to alienate the guests with strange flavors they're not used to." Daniel tried to mediate, but I could see the strain it was putting on him. He loved his mother, despite her flaws, and he desperately wanted us to get along. I found myself constantly walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace, swallowing my hurt and anger to maintain family harmony, just as my parents had taught me. The worst incident before our wedding happened at what was supposed to be a celebratory family dinner. Vivian had insisted on cooking, claiming she wanted to welcome me properly into the family. I'd reminded her about my allergies, even offered to bring my own food to avoid any issues, but she'd been offended by the suggestion. "Don't be ridiculous," she'd said. "I'm perfectly capable of cooking a simple meal without whatever imaginary ingredients you think you can't eat." That night, she served a beautiful salmon dish with what she claimed was a simple herb crust. But something felt wrong from the first bite. The texture was different, there was an unfamiliar flavor, and I started to feel that familiar tingling sensation in my mouth that always preceded an allergic reaction. I discreetly stopped eating and excused myself to the bathroom, where I took an antihistamine and tried to calm my racing heart. When I returned to the table, Vivian was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it disappointment? Curiosity? I couldn't be sure. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked with false concern. "You've barely touched your food." "I'm just feeling a bit off," I lied, not wanting to cause a scene. "The salmon is delicious, though." Later that evening, as we drove home, I told Daniel about my reaction. He was immediately concerned and wanted to call Vivian to find out exactly what she'd put in the herb crust, but I talked him out of it, convincing him it was probably just cross-contamination or my imagination. I wanted to believe it was an accident, that his mother would never intentionally put me at risk. Looking back now, as I lay in that hospital bed with machines keeping me alive, I realized that night was a test run. Vivian had been studying me, learning my reactions, figuring out exactly how much she could get away with. She'd been planning this for months, maybe even years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to eliminate the obstacle standing between her and her son's undivided attention. The wedding went off without any major incidents, though Vivian managed to make several passive-aggressive comments during her mother of the groom speech about hoping I'd learn to truly become part of the family. Daniel and I honeymooned in Japan, visiting my grandmother's hometown and exploring temples and gardens that felt like stepping into a living painting. For a few blissful weeks, I thought maybe marriage would change things. Maybe Vivian would finally accept me now that I was officially part of the family. Maybe we could find a way to coexist for Daniel's sake. I was naive to think a wedding ceremony could change 3 decades of ingrained prejudice and control issues.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
If anything, Vivian seemed to see my new status as Daniel's wife as an even greater threat to her position as the most important woman in his life. The poisoning happened on a Tuesday evening in late October, exactly 8 months after our wedding. Daniel had been working late at the hospital, covering for a colleague who'd called in sick, and I'd been planning to have a quiet evening at home catching up on research papers. That's when Vivian called. Her voice was unusually warm and friendly, which should have been my first warning sign. She rarely called me directly, preferring to go through Daniel for any family communications. But that evening, she seemed almost giddy with excitement. "Isabella, darling," she said, and I actually held the phone away from my ear to make sure I was hearing correctly. She'd never called me darling before. "I've just finished making the most incredible lasagna, and there's far too much for just me. Would you be able to come over for dinner? I know Daniel is working late, but I thought it might be nice for us to have some girl time." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to decline politely and stay home. Vivian and I had never had girl time in the entire 3 years I'd known her. Our interactions were always strained, formal affairs where I felt like I was walking through a minefield of potential offenses. But something in her tone made me hesitate. Maybe this was her way of extending an olive branch. Maybe she'd finally decided to accept me as part of the family. Maybe all my patient endurance and determined kindness had finally paid off, and we could start building a real relationship. "That's very thoughtful of you, Vivian," I said carefully. "Are you sure it wouldn't be any trouble?" "No trouble at all," she assured me. "In fact, I insist. I've been thinking about how little quality time we've spent together, just the two of us. It's about time we remedied that, don't you think?" Against my better judgment, I agreed to come over. I even stopped at the florist on the way to pick up a small bouquet of autumn flowers, thinking it might be a nice gesture to bring to what I hoped would be the beginning of a better relationship between us. Vivian's house always felt like a museum to me, all polished surfaces and carefully arranged antiques that seemed to whisper warnings about not touching anything. But that evening, something felt different. There was a strange energy in the air, an almost electric anticipation that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Vivian greeted me at the door, wearing a flowing burgundy dress and a smile that was wider than I'd ever seen on her face. She took the flowers with what seemed like genuine appreciation and ushered me into the dining room, where she'd set the table with her finest china and crystal glasses. "You look lovely tonight, Isabella," she said. And again, I found myself wondering if I was in some kind of alternate reality. "I hope you brought your appetite. I've outdone myself with this lasagna." The dining room smelled incredible, rich with the aromas of garlic, herbs, and melted cheese. Vivian had dimmed the lights and lit several candles, creating an almost romantic atmosphere that felt strangely intimate for a dinner between a woman and her daughter-in-law. She served me an enormous portion of lasagna, much larger than I would normally eat, along with a generous glass of red wine that she insisted came from a very special bottle she'd been saving for a meaningful occasion. "This smells amazing," I said, cutting into the perfectly layered pasta. "What's your secret ingredient?" Vivian's eyes sparkled in the candlelight. "Oh, just a little something extra I added to make it special. A blend of herbs and spices that's been in the Hartwell family for generations." The first few bites tasted normal, rich and savory, with the perfect balance of meat sauce and cheese. But as I continued eating, I began to notice a slightly odd aftertaste, something vaguely metallic that I couldn't quite identify. I took a sip of wine to wash it away, but the strange flavor seemed to linger. Vivian watched me eat with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. She barely touched her own food, instead focusing all her attention on making sure my glass stayed full and encouraging me to have seconds, then thirds. "You're such a tiny thing," she said, with what sounded like maternal concern. You need to eat more. Daniel worries that you're not taking proper care of yourself. I doubted Daniel had ever said anything of the sort, but I didn't want to contradict her when she was being so unusually pleasant. I forced myself to keep eating, even as that metallic taste grew stronger and my stomach began to feel unsettled. As the evening progressed, Vivian became more talkative than I'd ever seen her. She told me stories about Daniel's childhood, shared family recipes, and even showed me photo albums I'd never been permitted to see before. It was almost like spending time with a completely different person. But then, about an hour into dinner, something shifted. Vivian's conversation took a strange turn, becoming more personal and probing than usual. "You know, Isabella," she said, refilling my wine glass yet again, "I've been doing some research about your work at the pharmaceutical company. It must be fascinating, developing all those medications for people with allergies and sensitivities." I nodded, unsure where she was going with this. "It's rewarding work. There are so many people who suffer from conditions that could be easily managed with the right treatments." Vivian hummed, thoughtfully, "though I still maintain that many of these so-called allergies are psychological rather than physical. The mind is incredibly powerful, you know. It can convince the body to react to things that aren't actually harmful." Here we go again, I thought, but I tried to keep my voice neutral. "While stress and anxiety can certainly exacerbate allergic reactions, the underlying immune response is very real and measurable. When someone with a shellfish allergy is exposed to even trace amounts of shellfish protein, their body produces specific antibodies that trigger a cascade of physical symptoms." Vivian's eyes became sharper, more predatory. "But what if someone believed so strongly that they were allergic to something that their body would react even if the allergen wasn't actually present? Mind over matter, as they say." I was starting to feel dizzy, and my heart was beating faster than normal. I assumed it was just the wine making me lightheaded, since I rarely drank more than a glass with dinner. "That's not really how allergies work," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The immune system responds to specific molecular structures. It can't be fooled by belief or expectation." "How interesting," Vivian said, her eyes never leaving my face. "And how confident are you in that assessment?" Something in her tone made my blood run cold. There was a smugness there, a satisfaction that didn't match the academic nature of our conversation. I looked down at my nearly empty plate and suddenly felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with overeating. "Vivian, what exactly did you put in this lasagna?" Her smile widened, and for the first time that evening, it reached her eyes. "Oh, just a few special ingredients. Nothing you haven't had before, I'm sure." My throat was starting to feel tight, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. These were early warning signs I recognized all too well, the beginning stages of an allergic reaction. I reached into my purse for my EpiPen, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grasp it. "What kind of special ingredients?" I asked, my voice already starting to sound strained.
Vivian leaned back in her chair, looking incredibly pleased with herself. "Well, let's see. There was some lovely crab meat I had in the freezer from last summer, and I ground up some walnuts to add texture to the meat sauce. Oh, and I used a delicious pesto made with pine nuts instead of my usual herbs." The room started spinning around me. Crab, walnuts, and pine nuts, three of my most severe allergens, all carefully incorporated into a meal that she'd insisted I eat every bite of. This wasn't an accident or cross-contamination. This was deliberate, calculated, and potentially lethal. "You knew," I whispered, struggling to breathe as my throat continued to constrict. "You knew exactly what you were doing." "Of course I knew," Vivian said calmly, sipping her wine as if she were discussing the weather. "I've been planning this for months. Do you really think I'm so stupid that I wouldn't remember your little list of dramatic dietary restrictions?" I managed to get my EpiPen out of my purse, but my vision was starting to blur and my hands were trembling so violently I wasn't sure I could use it properly. Vivian watched my struggle with detached interest, like she was observing a mildly entertaining science experiment. "Help me," I gasped, holding out the EpiPen toward her. "Please, call 911. She made no move to help, instead taking another leisurely sip of her wine. "You know, Isabella, I really thought this allergy nonsense of yours was just attention-seeking behavior, but you're putting on quite a convincing performance. Perhaps there's something to it after all." I jabbed the EpiPen into my thigh, feeling the rush of epinephrine flooding my system. It might buy me some time, but I needed medical attention immediately. My phone was in my purse, but my hands were shaking too badly to dial. "Why?" I managed to whisper as the medication temporarily eased some of my symptoms. Vivian's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Because you were never supposed to be permanent, Isabella. You were Daniel's rebellious phase, his way of asserting independence from his family. But then you had to go and marry him, didn't you? You had to make it official." She stood up and began clearing the dishes, moving with calm efficiency as I struggled to stay conscious in my chair. "Daniel is a Hartwell," she continued conversationally. "Our family has a reputation to maintain, a legacy to preserve. He needs a wife who understands that legacy, someone who can give him proper children and fit seamlessly into our social circle. You, with your foreign parents and your working-class background and your ridiculous dietary restrictions, were never going to be that person." The epinephrine was wearing off, and my symptoms were returning with a vengeance. My lips and tongue were swelling, making it nearly impossible to speak, and I could feel my airways closing up again. "The best part," Vivian said, loading plates into the dishwasher with practiced efficiency, "is that everyone will assume it was your own carelessness. Poor Isabella, so paranoid about her allergies, but somehow managed to eat something that killed her anyway. Daniel will be devastated, of course, but he'll recover, and next time he'll choose more wisely." I tried to reach for my phone again, but I collapsed onto the floor instead, my body convulsing as it struggled to function without adequate oxygen. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was Vivian humming softly to herself as she finished cleaning up the evidence of her attempted murder. When I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, Detective Sarah Rodriguez was sitting beside my bed with a notebook in her lap and the most serious expression I'd ever seen on a human face. Daniel was slumped in a chair on the other side of the room, his scrubs wrinkled and his eyes red-rimmed from what I could only assume were days of crying and sleepless nights. The detective introduced herself and explained that I'd been found by Daniel when he'd returned home from the hospital and couldn't reach me by phone. Worried, he'd driven to his mother's house and discovered me unconscious on her dining room floor. Vivian had claimed she'd stepped out to walk her neighbor's dog and returned to find me collapsed, insisting she had no idea what could have caused such a severe allergic reaction. "Mrs. Hartwell," Detective Rodriguez said gently, "we'd like to ask you some questions about what happened that evening, if you're feeling up to it." My throat was still raw from the intubation, but I managed to croak out the most important words. "She poisoned me. It was deliberate." Daniel's head snapped up from where he'd been staring at his hands. "Isabella, that's impossible. My mother would never. I told her exactly what she put in the food. Crab meat, walnuts, and pine nuts. She watched me eat it, knowing it would kill me." The detective leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. "Can you tell me everything you remember about that evening?" I recounted every detail I could recall, from Vivian's unusually friendly phone call to her cold confession as I lay dying on her floor. Daniel's face grew paler with each revelation, and by the time I finished, he was staring at me with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "There has to be some mistake. She's difficult, yes, But she's not a murderer. She's my mother. The detective closed her notebook and stood up. Mr. Hartwell, I understand this is difficult to process, but we've already begun our investigation, and there are some things you both need to know. She explained that they'd obtained a warrant to search Vivian's house and had found several disturbing pieces of evidence. In her kitchen trash, they'd discovered empty containers of canned crab meat and crushed walnut shells, along with a jar of pine nut pesto that had been scraped clean. More damning still, they'd found internet search histories on her computer dating back to months, including queries about lethal doses of common allergens and how to disguise the taste of shellfish in Italian dishes. But the most shocking discovery was a handwritten journal hidden in Vivian's bedroom. Page after page documented her growing obsession with getting rid of me, complete with detailed plans for making my death look like an accidental exposure to allergens. She'd been planning this for almost a year. The journal entries show a clear progression from general resentment to specific homicidal intent. She researched my medical history, contacted my previous doctors under false pretenses, and even consulted with online forums about the most effective ways to trigger fatal allergic reactions. Daniel made a strangled sound and buried his face in his hands. I wanted to comfort him, but I was struggling to process the magnitude of what his mother had done myself. The detective continued, "We also found evidence that this wasn't her first attempt. Do you remember feeling unwell after eating at her house on previous occasions?" I thought back to that dinner before our wedding. The strange metallic taste and mild reaction I dismissed as cross-contamination. The salmon dinner. She was testing my reactions, wasn't she? The journal suggests exactly that. She documents several trial runs where she introduced small amounts of allergens into your food to study your responses and determine the quantities needed for a lethal dose. 2 days later, Vivian was arrested at her home and charged with attempted murder in the first degree. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly our private nightmare became public entertainment. The headlines were sensational. Society matron attempts to murder daughter-in-law with allergies. Dinner party turns deadly. The poisoning plot that shocked Bellingham. Daniel was devastated. The man I'd married, who'd always seen the best in everyone, couldn't reconcile the mother he'd loved with the cold-blooded woman who had tried to kill his wife.
He took a leave of absence from the hospital and spent hours sitting by my bedside, apologizing over and over for not protecting me, for not seeing what his mother truly was. "I should have known," he kept saying. "All those comments about your allergies, all the time she made you uncomfortable. I should have seen the signs." But I didn't blame Daniel. Vivian had been manipulating him his entire life, presenting herself as the perfect mother while hiding her true nature behind a carefully constructed facade. He'd been as much a victim of her deception as I had been. The trial began 6 months later, and it was a media circus. Vivian had hired the most expensive defense attorney in the state, a slick man named Gregory Blackwood, who tried to paint me as a hysterical woman seeking attention and revenge against an innocent elderly lady. His strategy was to claim that I'd accidentally ingested the allergens and then blamed Vivian out of spite. That my foreign mentality made me prone to dramatic overreactions and false accusations. He suggested that Vivian's internet searches were merely the natural curiosity of a grandmother trying to understand her daughter-in-law's medical condition. But the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, had built an airtight case. They presented the journal entries in excruciating detail, showing the jury exactly how methodically Vivian had planned my murder. They called medical experts who testified about the impossibility of accidentally ingesting 3 different allergens in the quantities found in my blood tests. Most damning of all was the testimony from Vivian's own neighbors. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door, testified that Vivian had never walked her dog, despite claiming that's where she'd been when I collapsed. Mr. Peterson from across the street revealed that Vivian had approached him months earlier, asking seemingly innocent questions about my work schedule and when I was usually home alone. The jury also heard from my former colleagues, who testified about the legitimate medical research I conducted and my professional reputation, effectively dismantling the defense's portrayal of me as unstable or attention-seeking. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Daniel took the stand. His voice breaking with emotion, he testified about finding me unconscious on his mother's floor, about the terror of thinking he'd lost the woman he loved to what appeared to be a tragic accident. When the detective first suggested this might be intentional, he said, tears streaming down his face, I defended my mother. I couldn't believe she was capable of such evil. But the evidence doesn't lie, and neither does my wife. My mother tried to murder the person I love most in the world, and she almost succeeded. Vivian showed no remorse throughout the entire trial. She sat ramrod straight in her defendant's chair, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression one of wounded dignity rather than guilt. Even when the most damning evidence was presented, she maintained an air of superiority, as if the proceedings were beneath her consideration. The only time her composure cracked was during the reading of her own journal entries. As the prosecutor read aloud her detailed fantasies about my death and her plans for comforting Daniel through his grief while secretly celebrating her victory, Vivian's carefully maintained mask slipped for just a moment. I saw pure rage flash across her features, not remorse for what she'd done, but fury at being cut and exposed. The trial lasted 3 months, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with a guilty verdict on all charges, the courtroom erupted in applause. Vivian was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with the judge noting the premeditated nature of her crime and her complete lack of remorse as aggravating factors. During her sentencing, Vivian was given the opportunity to make a statement. Instead of apologizing or showing any hint of regret, she used the moment to deliver one final attack. That woman, she said, pointing directly at me, has destroyed my family and stolen my son. She has turned him against his own mother with her lies and manipulations. I am innocent of these charges, and someday the truth will come out. Even facing decades in prison, she couldn't admit what she'd done or acknowledge the pain she had caused. In her mind, she was still the victim, still the righteous mother protecting her son from an unworthy wife. 6 months after the trial ended, Daniel and I made the difficult decision to leave Washington State entirely. Too many memories haunted every corner of our life there, and Daniel needed distance from the place where his mother had tried to murder his wife. We moved to Colorado, where Daniel took a position at Denver General Hospital, and I found work with a biotechnology company developing new treatments for autoimmune disorders. The change of scenery helped, but the emotional scars took much longer to heal. Daniel struggled with guilt and depression for nearly 2 years, convinced that he should have seen through his mother's facade and protected me better. He started therapy and gradually began to understand that he'd been as much a victim of Vivian's manipulation as anyone else. As for me, I had to rebuild my sense of safety in the world. For months, I couldn't eat anything I hadn't prepared myself. I had panic attacks in restaurants and grocery stores, convinced that everyone around me might be plotting to poison my food. It took extensive therapy and Daniel's patient support to help me reclaim my life from the fear his mother had planted in it. We received letters from Vivian occasionally, always maintaining her innocence and pleading for Daniel to visit her in prison. He threw them away unopened after the first few, finally accepting that the woman who'd raised him had been capable of unthinkable evil. 3 years later, we welcomed our daughter Emma into the world. She's a beautiful, healthy baby with Daniel's kind eyes and my stubborn determination. Sometimes I catch Daniel staring at her with wonder, as if he can't quite believe that something so pure and innocent came from his family line. Vivian will never meet her granddaughter. We've made sure of that. Emma will grow up knowing that she has a grandmother who's in prison, but she'll also know that sometimes protecting the people you love means cutting toxic family members out of your life entirely. The most important thing I learned from this experience is that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears the face of respectability, hides behind social status and family connections, and strikes when you're most vulnerable. But the truth has power, and justice, though sometimes slow, is possible when people are brave enough to speak up and fight for what's right. Last month marked 5 years since Vivian's conviction, and I received an unexpected call from Detective Rodriguez. She informed me that Vivian had died in prison from complications related to a stroke. Despite everything she'd put us through, I felt no satisfaction hearing this news, only a strange emptiness and relief that this chapter of our lives was finally, definitively closed. Daniel took the news harder than I expected. Even after everything his mother had done, losing her felt like losing the last connection to his childhood, to the woman he'd believed her to be before learning the truth. We attended a small memorial service with just a handful of people, mostly distant relatives who still couldn't quite believe what Vivian had been capable of.
At the service, Daniel's aunt pulled me aside and apologized for not speaking up sooner about Vivian's behavior over the years. She confessed that many family members had witnessed Vivian's cruelty, but had dismissed it as her being particular or old-fashioned. The guilt in her eyes was palpable when she admitted they'd all failed to protect me when they should have recognized the warning signs. Today, Emma is 3 years old and fills her home with laughter that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark days. She's fearless and curious about everything, traits I hope will serve her well in life. Daniel has become an incredible father, patient and nurturing in ways that show me he's nothing like the woman who raised him. We've built new traditions for our family, one centered around love and acceptance rather than manipulation and control. Our home is filled with photos celebrating Emma's milestones, artwork she's created at preschool, and the warmth of genuine family bonds. We host dinner parties where everyone is welcome exactly as they are, where dietary restrictions are respected without question, and where love isn't conditional on meeting impossible standards. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Vivian had succeeded that night. Would Daniel have eventually seen through her act, or would she have comforted him through his grief while secretly celebrating her victory? The thought still chills me, but it also reminds me how precious the life we've built together really is. Emma will grow up knowing her story, age-appropriately, of course, because I want her to understand that family isn't always safe just because they share your blood. More importantly, I want her to know that speaking up against injustice, even when it's frightening, is always the right choice. The experience changed us both, but it also made us stronger. We learned that love isn't enough if it's built on denial and willful blindness. Real love requires courage, the courage to see people as they really are and to protect those that matter most, even from family members who wish them harm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.